everyone. Welcome to the Atlas Waterfront P&Z workshop. Can you hear me out there? They can't hear us out at the...
They won't be able to until you talk.
I have been talking. Can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon to the Planning and Zoning Workshop for the Atlas Waterfront project. If we can have roll call, Shannon.
Messina.
Here.
Fleming. Here. Ingalls.
Here.
Lutrip.
Here.
Mendel. Here. Rumpler.
Here.
Ward.
Okay. Before we start the workshop, just sort of explain, the Atlas Waterfront team would give us a presentation. At this point, it's to update the Planning and Zoning Commissions on kind of more details of it. There isn't going to be any public testimony on this particular item today, so I just want to inform the people who are in the audience of that. So with that, Hillary, or?
Commission for convening for this part 2 of the Atlas Waterfront Preliminary Design and Development Standards discussion. And I did want to apologize to a few members of the audience that are here for our slightly delayed start. We surprised the Planning Commission with the room format, so apologize, commissioners, for that as well. We are televising this and doing the Facebook live stream today, just so that the community members know what we're doing. And this really is just kind of an update and study session to get feedback back to the Welch, Comer, and GGLO team. So Phil will start off with kind of a little bit of background and an update on the public space for Atlas Waterfront, and then Don Vey with GGLO will give the bulk of the presentation and kind of update you on what's been done. You each have copies of the current working product, so that's all I have.
And should we hold our questions to the end of the presentation if there are some, or however they...
You know, I'm not sure. I'll let Don and Phil advise on
Great.
that. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Hillary. Okay.
Thank you, Chairman Messina and Commission members. Phil Boyd with Welch Comer Engineers. So you see the agenda on the screen. At the last meeting, which was very good with the board, we got a lot of good feedback, but the response we got from the Commission was, can you come back and provide us some additional details on doing density right, and then showing us another iteration of the development standards. So that's what we're here to do today, is provide you information about doing density well and how it creates this development, the foundation for the development standards. And that's really GGLO's expertise. They do it all across the West in the United States. I do want to start with a little public space update, because that's germane to obviously the development.
Phil, do you want us to ask questions during or after?
I think you should ask them. I think Don will agree. Just ask them as we go, because they're going to come up, and I think it would be great for you guys to have dialogue with Don and extract out of his brain the expertise that he's bringing here today. So I think that's a great idea. Just a little update. The 3 prior meetings to this, we have had a Parks and Rec Commission meeting with the public. We had a Parks and Rec City Council meeting. We had a City Council Ignite meeting, and they were workshops. And the objective of those meetings was soliciting public input, presenting the public space development ideas to the Parks and Rec Commission, and getting them to prioritize potential additional improvements, because Ignite may decide to provide additional funding for the public space in the Atlas area. So we went through all of those meetings. The last one was the Ignite City Council meeting, and the objective was for the Ignite board to hear what the City Council felt about the potential public improvements. The short story is this is what the City Council said in the Atlas waterfront area, what we would like you to consider, consider adding funding to. And I won't go into them in detail, but the water dog park, which is down in this area, converting this area, which is, if you've been down there, is a brambly area that's not a beach, but it once was a beach. So turning that into a beach, putting an accessible kayak launch in here so folks of all abilities can get into the water, adding a playground up in this area. This area, we had considered putting an underpass for the Centennial Trail that would actually go under Suzanne, but it was an expensive proposition, and the at-grade crossing was selected, like all the crossings currently on the Centennial Trail. This water feature here was not part of the mix that went in. Adding future access and water access in this location, future dock access. The docks may come in the future, but we'll set up for the gangway. So if a dock does happen to come into place, you can move it in there and the upland structure will be in place. Water access is in these areas, a big significant water access and a small beach in that area, and additional water access in there. Up in this area, there's the idea to put the food truck area in there, because that's becoming very popular and it adds energy and activity to the public space. The vendor building that's right down in this area would also double as a police building, and exactly what that means is still in the design process. And then a park maintenance building right down in this area. And all of these buildings would have a character that speaks to the historic nature, historic use of that when buildings were there, and the mill-type structures. That's kind of the style of the building that would be in that area. So that's just, again, provided to give you guys context of this part of the project.
Phil, is that in our booklet here?
It's not in there. The booklet that you have is just the development standards, and it's literally the beginnings of what will become the final product. I can certainly get you a copy of this. Any questions?
I have a comment. One thing at Hayden Lake, at Honeysuckle Beach, is I thought it was brilliant that they did the loop around that separates the swimmers from the boats. And what I notice is we've got a swim beach that's, you got the loop of the boat and maybe there's a boat coming in on the inside line. If we could cordon off that connection so that boats don't come around and that there is a protected zone for people who do want to randomly do laps or, have safe swimming zone dedicated. And I think that, Hayden achieved it very well.
That's an excellent comment. One of the things that you might, if you've been down on the water in this area, the pilings that exist there.
I know, they're there.
They're there, and so we actually intend to take advantage of that where we can. We actually went out and mapped all the pilings, and we intend to put log booms in.
Oh, good.
Provided we can get the correct permitting from Department of Lands, but log boom these areas, similar to the way the NIC beach is boomed off.
Okay.
Following up on Lynn's question, along the beach here in the city, well, that's the city too, there's a certain area past which the boats aren't supposed to go. They put buoys out there on the beach and so on. Does that apply here to the river?
I don't know specifically, but I would certainly, those rights to be able to put that buoy out there comes through the Idaho Department of Lands. You have to apply for the permit.
I believe it's a city item too, and I believe that that's annexed. It may well be that it is a thing to do to provide swimmers there, to block it off.
Safe.
So it's just being mindful of it, not following the rules.
Yep, it's part of our design process that when we're figuring out exactly where people are going to be in the water is doing exactly what Commissioner Fleming is talking about, is providing some physical separation and visual separation, as you're also indicating. So it's part of the design process, and we intend to put it in there and apply for the permits necessary.
Okay.
Okay. Well, good. I'll turn it over to Don Beggy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Hello, Commissioners. Glad to be back. And in regards to your question about questions, I would actually appreciate it. It's conceived of as a workshop. And so let's, even though this is a very formal physical arrangement here, let's, I think, try to make it that way. So I would appreciate that. Jumping into, so what I'm going to do is two parts here. And this also is not in your packet, but we can provide this. This is, we talked about sort of a density 101, or what do we think about when we're designing communities like this and what makes density livable. This is a presentation that I've kind of tailored to this project based on something that I've done in various parts around Washington, Oregon, basically around the entire Northwest. When we're looking at mixed use, walkable communities, these are sort of the fundamentals. So first of all, I'm just going to do some numbers here, And if you know all this and want me to move on, again, say so. But I think it's always helpful when we're having a discussion about density is to sort of get the numbers thing out of the way right off the bat. Because what do we mean when we're talking about 34 units per acre, 17 units per acre, things like that? Are we measuring that in a gross versus a net way? And what does that mean? And when we're working with folks in the community, this is always a point of confusion. So first going to do some numbers, and then I'm going to support it with the principles that are behind creating these denser projects and slightly denser places. So this is an example of a neighborhood in southeast Seattle, and so you have some existing single-family fabric. You have a development that's underway. It's actually since been completed on this side, but just to set the stage for a couple of different types and the bottom end, if you will, of the density scale. A typical block in Seattle is around 600 feet long, 200 to 300 feet wide overall. And so when we're talking about gross on a typical block, it's including the public space. So it's including at least half the street. It's in this case, there's an alley, so it would be including the alley, basically all the right-of-way associated with that block combined with the private development. And if we look at this block, this particular one, it comes out to a density at a gross of 6.5 units per acre. And it's pretty typical when you look at American cities of all types that developed in a grid pattern that you see some number like this, and you may be familiar with this already. I would suspect that downtown or the central portion of Coeur d'Alene is similar, perhaps a little bit lower because the lots are on average perhaps a little wider than what you would have in Seattle or a Portland or a Minneapolis neighborhood, where there's typically 40-foot wide lots on average, or here it tends to be 50-ish, so that'll probably bring that number down a little bit. If we look at it just from a net point of view, subtracting out that public realm, closer to 10 units per acre. Again, that's also pretty typical for cities of this type. For primarily single-family neighborhoods. Now, let's start to go up that scale a bit. Looking at townhouses, and so what you're going to see here are a series of images. These first two images are from all further points from that aerial photograph I showed you a few minutes ago, and then jump to some other sites. So a typical townhouse development, in this case it's an affordable housing project. These are anywhere from 20 to 24 feet wide in this example. If you look at it from that net basis, which is how I'm going to show you the most of these numbers going forward, comes out to around 14 units per acre. And that's pretty typical for townhouse projects of this type, where they're just side by side, kind of like single family, attached together. Another type of townhouse project, looking at a larger site. This is a GGLO project that was actually developed in the late 90s, but it's a pretty good model from a typology point of view. When I say that year, you kind of sense that when you're looking at the character of the buildings here. There's a courtyard here, and there's actually townhouses around a perimeter. This is one of the first urban projects to go into downtown Redmond. It's since grown up around here, but one of the first. So this is about a 6-acre site, 200 units, actually comes out to 34 units per acre. And what's interesting about that is there's no elevators. There actually are a few stacked flats right in the middle here and here, but the majority of this are various types of townhouses. And I mentioned live-work. This is a view actually from this corner here. There's a separate retail at this corner and this corner, which is not attached to the live above, but the rest of these in line along this edge and this edge and this edge here all have the potential for a home-based business. And then more traditional townhouses in the middle. So we've more than doubled the density from the sort of standard type of townhouse when we create a more unique site plan. What makes it livable is how it addresses the street, and how it creatively designs some of these auto courts to become shared spaces in between.
Mr. Chairman, do you mind if I ask Dawn a question on that one? So the 34 units per acre, if you can go back to that previous
Yes.
slide. So that's, obviously, that's kind of come up a lot recently with Planning Commission and Council for density. And this one, so it just seems that 34 units per acre is higher than what it would be for townhouses if it's all kind of single-family ownership of each of the townhouses with a zero lot line.
Yeah.
Does that include the stacked flats for apartments in that
It does in this
density?
case. It's
Okay.
really a small number here, so it's not a big density bump. That's why I feel pretty comfortable putting it in here. Did that answer?
It does, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
So if we, now this is a project from Portland, and in the Belmont neighborhood, it's called Belmont Dairy, and there was a former dairy site. It's kind of an interesting, it was a redevelopment of all these blocks that I'm outlining that go off the aerial here. There's more of a mixed-use buildings here, and two variations on some very tall, skinny townhouses. No elevator here. These are done extraordinarily well. These similar pattern, not executed quite as well. We could come back and talk about that some other time. But what's interesting about this is create a small lane here and here with service to garages. Each of these units is about a 21-foot wide unit by 30 to 32 foot deep. All have garage, garage, garage behind, fronting on a pedestrian, like a pedestrian street or muse here in the middle, and that's what this photograph is showing. And then there's a similar character to these units out on the street edges here. There is a lane in between here that is designed quite nicely as a bit of a Wunnerf, so it's a mix of cars and pedestrians that does have a few garages and but has a similar character with unit entries for pedestrians off of that Wunnerf as well. What's interesting about this, it's still a townhouse product, but we're up to 41 units per acre. So it just shows you that those three examples, there's a lot that you can do with a townhouse type. And so that's one of the reasons we've been looking at it quite a bit as the potential for Atlas Mill redevelopment. If we, now, going up the density range into, starting to look at stacked flats. In this case, there's a combination of just 3-story stacked flats here. This is along a light rail line. This is also within that very first aerial that I showed you, actually. Light rail here. There's some retail and services on the ground level, and some senior apartments above. This density, when you take the half of the block that it occupies plus some of the parking behind, is 66 units per acre. Because it's a transit-oriented development, it has very limited parking. There is not parking below. And that's what reaches this number. If we occupied more of the block or said that this parking here was serving it, which it's not, but if you did, that number would go down. It just gives you a flavor for what the number at 66 units per acre starts to look like on a net basis. In Western Washington, Western Oregon, what we're starting to see a lot in Boise is development. I have 5 stories over 1 story of retail or lobbies or amenity space down below, or even 5 stories over 2. This is Juanita Village in Kirkland, the Juanita section of Kirkland. It's actually now since all been developed. The areas that are outlined here in yellow and these two, this one comes out to pretty much the same net density of 87 units per acre. It's a pretty typical number, around plus or minus 85 units per acre for a building type and development like this. Hold the thought on this Starbucks here. I'm going to come back to this. If you know this project, you know it was one of the first buildings to go in here, and it sits actually right here. That'll come up again in the principles. This has actually all been built out to fruition, but in terms of this exhibit, just going back from a net point of view, this is Burien Town Square, an engagement of the Main Street in downtown Burien near SeaTac, and 3 buildings of a similar type to what I just showed you from Juanita, with a park and a new city hall. It's about a 10-acre site. But if you look at it on a block-by-block net basis, you can see 89. It's very similar to the previous project. But if we go back and look at it, this goes back to that gross versus net idea. If you run the numbers on that 10-acre square as a whole, it actually comes down to 50. So just, again, allows you to understand those numbers a little bit better. If we're looking from a net basis, this is in the Capitol Hill neighborhood in Seattle, a similar building type, but much more tight, actually has underground parking. It's a 4-story over 1. There's a drugstore at the base on a tight quarter-block site. Because it's so tight and so urban, and the site is limited, this is measured out at a net basis at 130 units per acre. And I know we're not getting into these densities here, but just to kind of end the bracketing here, from the Pearl District in Portland, something adjacent to the first streetcar line, apartment project with a retail base, amenity base, some townhouses engaging. There's actually, because of the water table, parking is not buried, parking is below, or excuse me, in the sandwich of layers here. But it's about 300 units. So that on a Portland block, 200 by 200, nets out at 250 units per acre. So obviously we're going to be talking about ideas for this site, for Atlas site, probably at the lower end of the scale. But each one of these has some aspects to them, and from what I'm going to now talk about what makes this density livable. Sometimes it's about the project, sometimes it's about the neighborhood and the place that it exists within. And really, the livability comes as a combination of both of those things.
Mr. Chairman?
Any questions now?
Yeah, I got a question. Regarding any of the residential that is closest to the public space in the river, are they going to be all the same height, regardless of whatever the units might be, apartments or single families and stuff? Or is there going to be a step back kind of height? If you're closer to the public space, it'll be lower than as you go back further to maybe not have an impact. Have you looked at anything like that?
Well, the idea that's in here and that I've talked about, and I was going to, when I get into that, the next part was to provide actually along the Riverfront Drive, along that very important street. I believe it's actually very important to provide at least a 2-story building there to create a bit of a street wall and to create a sense of a backdrop for the street itself, a backdrop as you're looking from the river back, something overlooking the street down to the river. That's something we can talk about as we go into it further. We think about it from a side-to-side basis. So that's what. So a baseline, again, as I'm saying, 2-story. So think of a baseline of at least this high. I think it would be desirable to get a few places where it might go up to 3 stories. And then we've talked about the idea amongst all of us of if there's a mixed-use building that might go up to 4 stories. So if we think from a side-by-side basis, there might be some variety there. And we've been batting around, would love to hear from you what some of those transitions are between the two. For example, if we had, let's say, a 2-story townhouse or a series of 2-story townhouses on a block, transitioning then to perhaps an alley between, then leading to something more like this, perhaps at that retail core near where the Riverfront Drive, that center street comes down. What's an appropriate transition between something this tall versus something this tall? Can those things be adjacent to each other, or should there be a stepped tiered in the floor levels of the roof line as you go from building to building?
Okay. All right, great.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Something else. So I wanted to point out, so we did have that conversation as well, and we do want feedback from the commission on stepping of the heights. I know Commissioner Fleming had talked about that before. If we one thing that's nice about the site is there's the natural topography, so we have opportunities anyway to provide views at each of the blocks as you go away from the river. The other thing I want to point out on this slide, so I don't want everybody to be scared, because density is a scary word, and you look at these images and you're like, oh my gosh, 41 units per acre, 66 units per acre. So we're going to look at Atlas, so it's 48 acres across the whole site. So 17 units per acre across the whole site, but then you can kind of cluster those units together. So your gross, you're not going to be exceeding 17 units per acre. We're not going to come in and say we need a, R34 or R66 on the whole site. We're going to be able to kind of shift some of the units, so we're still achieving the overall density, but clustering it to keep the open space along the riverfront and some of the view corridors and things that have been discussed before. So I think that's helpful to be aware of.
And taking a little bit further, and I know these are the design standards and we talked about, and I apologize for my not dressing the part today. I didn't know this was going to be televised, so I apologize for my baseball cap and such. But and I know we're going to give flexibility to the staff to make changes for developers to come in, and that's based on perhaps the timeline of getting things done. And as you just said, Hillary, with the density and stuff and setbacks, hopefully if someone comes in and we've done our design standards and say, here's our setbacks and here's our height and keep our open space and units per acre and stuff, and then they want to change that aspect of the section. And again, this is my concern more than any, I'm not talking for the whole commission. How is that going to be handled? Because it's all great that we say, hey, our density is this, and we got to keep our open space, and we got to keep it away from the river, and et cetera, et cetera. But then someone comes in, and I'm all for a speedy development and selling the property and helping the city pay for this project. But again, if that type of a change happens where it's really different than what we are talking about and what the team is trying to present here for the community, there's my concern. Not saying staff doesn't have the ability to make that change and stuff. How is that? Where is the fine line there from?
John's going to be addressing that because that's something we've talked about is, how do we build in some sense of, assurance with the plan, but allow some flexibility. But we did talk about that today. And how do we work with Ignite too as the properties are sold off for development, that we're keeping track of the units and the what's happening within the project.
Right, and that it's going to look, the finished product's going to look like what we said, because basically that's why we're having these workshops, to have all the input for the city. And unfortunately, we've gone through this before, and sometimes the end result isn't exactly what all the workshops were talked about. So I'm talking personally for myself, not the rest of the commission, but that's my biggest concern.
Right.
And so.
Well, I appreciate that.
And if I'm jumping ahead of some of this stuff.
It's okay. It's fine. No problem. This is why, just to the larger point that you're making, is why we're kind of racking our brains to get a kind of a tailored, relatively detailed, where it needs to be detailed set of standards for certain blocks, so that we get that predictability that you're looking for, where it counts. And that's, after we go through all this, and you all, now I'm jumping ahead, and you have a chance to look at this after the workshop on your own time, and provide us perhaps some comments back. Would love to hear where you think we might need more or less flexibility.
Okay, great.
Don, on these examples, were you involved in any of them or all of them?
I've been involved in this project, and in this project, especially these two here.
Under similar circumstances we have here, where the design standards were set and then the property was sold, or?
This project here did not operate this way. These two projects are part of a master planned community, and where we were part of a team, a larger design team we paired with some other architects, and we developed the plan just like we've been doing here. We actually designed these buildings and developed a series of design guidelines that was, how would I best describe this, was in addition to the Seattle City Code, which also was a baseline for this development as well.
So you have some real live experience with this.
Yeah.
And so the questions that we raised most likely will have been raised in past projects.
Yes.
So you have some experience and you'll help guide us, and I thank you.
That's my goal. Okay. So what what I wanted to say, so I wanted to just get that, a big part of that first part is kind of demystify some of the talk around zoning. Yes, there are numbers, and the numbers sound scary. I don't want to get caught on numbers, now I want to get past them. And so it's not to make the density about it like, it's good for you, it's not like vegetables, but it's like a choice that you want to make. And it's like the natural choice or something that's rewarding, or of course, there are great trade-offs here. And I would want to choose, or someone might want to choose to buy, rent, live in this place or one of these housing types. So all the ingredients that help to make that happen is what we've all been talking about, and it was great that Phil gave us an update on it, is one, creating a public realm that people love. And it's thinking about Atlas, this image is most relevant because it's part of a large redevelopment that really is focused on a central green space, in this case a man-made water feature, but we have this beautiful river that we're building upon here at Atlas Mill. But in other cases, it's more, in thinking about the denser images that I might have showed you, it's about creating public squares, programming them for different activities that people might want to attend, creating great streets. That's part of both a project like this, a project like Atlas, and this sort of moderate density project. This is in a suburb of Minneapolis. And we've been talking about alleys and other ways of thinking about the public realm, and there's ways that can even be thought of as an amenity. Not sure that this is exactly the right image for Atlas, but in some places where we're doing higher density development, you're really trying to think about all of those spaces between the buildings as a place that can be used not just functionally, but recreationally, socially. Oftentimes, creating some kind of a civic identity or anchor is important for some of these places. These two, this is a city hall, this is a library, this is that Starbucks I mentioned. This, along with this building, were the first two projects at Juanita Village. What's interesting about this, even though it's Starbucks, they developed a pretty interesting type here where there's community meeting rooms in this building. And I know that we've talked about the potential for that commercial that might happen at the central part of the waterfront along Riverfront Drive. Maybe there's an aspect to the spaces there that have something like this. Perhaps it's not publicly owned, but it might act publicly in terms of the interior use of the space. Tried to address that a little bit in the standards in this draft as well. Connecting to surrounding neighborhoods and amenities. We've been doing this. This is all built into the master plan for Atlas Waterfront redevelopment, connecting to Centennial Trail, to Riverstone, things like that. So I think we're knocking out of the park with this one. Providing easy access to bike and transit routes. The bike part, it goes right along with the connectivity we were just talking about. We all know that. The transit lines, we have the transit center that's being built nearby. The trails will provide access to that. And I know it's the B route that runs along Celtice, right? Maybe there's something that we might do. I'm just throwing this out there as I've been thinking about that. I don't know if there's potential for additional stops there, but the plan as it stands now is providing pretty good access to transit and has the potential to be more robust in the future. Let's just put it that way. It's pretty essential to develop, to create a great place where people are going to sort of live 24/7, live, walk, kind of creating that kind of a neighborhood to create a mix of uses. And so we are looking at that here for Atlas Mill, thinking about retail, potentially some office, and a range of different housing types. We've talked about that before, and we'll talk about that more as we get into the development standards. The meat of it comes into creating, within the development itself, ground level activities that engage the sidewalk, different kinds of street frontages. We're going to talk about that more, whether it's retail or restaurant, or residential, and that how this street level interaction can create a strong sense of community by seeing people coming and going from the place that you live or the place you might be recreating or dining or such. Parking. We all know that parking is a big deal for any redevelopment, and we need to be extremely smart about parking. And so what's being shown here is thinking about on-street parking, using that strategically to serve your retail, potentially having it maybe serve some of your parking requirement, so that you can potentially minimize the expense of having to do structured parking in a podium or underground like what's shown here, or slightly less expensive, but still a notable price point and takes up space of a wrapped parking structure here, wrapped with residential around, or things like this, where carefully concealing the parking in behind the units so that we can create that great streetscape, and engaging into these are actually a sketch of townhouses here. So there's street parking, parking courts, parking within the buildings, different ways that you can do, that you can achieve this without having to go to the expense of structure. And I alluded to that a little bit when I was talking about the Belmont dairy example from Portland earlier. I've got a whole bunch of slides here talking about neighboring relationships. And what this really is about making this proximity a good thing. And so if we think about courtyards, in this case, we've got townhouses and apartments surrounding this courtyard. There's a whole series. We're going to talk about layers here, just layers of space, something that's more shared for residents. In this case, there's a gate leading to a public street. This is the shared courtyard in between. But even this has a sense of communality to it, and the vegetation that is shown in this slide is intended to provide a privacy transition from that shared space to these units beyond, whether they're townhouses or apartment flats. That sense of privacy transition is important in a townhouse project or stacked flats. There's many of the same elements in sort of the anatomy of this streetscape are here. I'm going to talk about these more in a minute. And the other thing is thinking about individuality and the side-by-side relationships between units and differentiating that space, kind of learning the lessons from single-family houses and trying to bring all of those relationships in closer proximity and making those different domains very evident, sort of that notion of friendly fences. This inspired the frontage diagrams that we're developing within the development standards. But when we think about the edges of our streets, notice that there's no dimensions here. When we're working on some of our even higher density projects than what we're thinking about for Atlas, this happens to be a block in Seattle in Capitol Hill, we often are either designing ourselves or when we're creating standards like this, asking the applicant to consider all of these pieces of the puzzle from the street to the building wall. So we have the sidewalk, we have the right-of-way edge, some kind of a transition and threshold between the two, some amount of private outdoor space, thinking about what happens at that building edge, and is there a place that's occupiable sort of within the building wall through recesses, through underneath canopies, and having an appropriate amount of transparency and visual connections between the two creates that eyes on the street and that sense of community. So it's kind of that magic elixir of what makes a great street. And it can be achieved in all kinds of different ways, which is all I'm trying to now show you by going through a few more slides. This is actually not the same project. It's very similar. It has brick. You may recognize this. This is from the Pearl District in Portland, townhouses. Even these very traditional single-family homes have all of these aspects. And it's not necessarily that you need to do all of these things. For example, perhaps the vertical separation is not necessary. There's other things that you can do to sort of provide some of that same separation, whether it's vegetation, whether it's a little bit more of a setback, but at least that all of these issues are considered. another diagram that shows you that anatomy of a great residential frontage. And what I like about this one here, so here's a diagram. This is a project actually on the UBC campus in Vancouver, and it's a really great example of how to make flats very livable. So you see all of the elements that I've been hinting at happen at the streetscape. There's great eyes on the street, and it's augmented by these very generous balconies that help provide some overlook, obviously amenity space associated, outdoor amenity associated with the unit, and a sense of visual connection between the people inside and outside the units from the street. And if this goes back to that project you were asking about, where I said it's a master plan that then led to development. This is the Rainier Vista project in Seattle, where the train is out here. All of those elements you start to see coming together around this community park. I'm going to ignore the dimensions. We can come back to if you want. This is about creating a safe park. It's a very successful park as part of this development, but it's surrounded by a host of different townhouses at different heights, at different price points, and you see all of those pieces of the puzzle from the streetscape back to the front door of the house, the small yard, the vertical separation, the thresholds that are happening on all of the units that are around here. The other thing that's interesting about this, if I talk about neighboring relationships, and it happens, you think about the orientation. So everyone's fronting on, for the most part, fronting on the park. We have a little bit of a hill climb condition here, or a mid-block crossing, and we're proposing a few of those here at Atlas. And what's important there is that it has a bit of width. Here, these could perhaps side on it better, but there's a fair amount of glazing and transparency, so providing eyes on that walk. There's units behind, there's a large tree that was maintained here. There's 2 sets of townhouses here that face this in the upper portion, a small shared space in between. And it's getting a little less dense as you come up this hillside towards single family up and away at the top of the hill. So that was a lot about neighboring relationships, but I think that is the reason I hit it so hard is that that's what makes these things work for people. If we just think about a few more things about the exterior parts of the buildings, creatively modulate the building mass and height. That's kind of jargony, but as we think about how we articulate the buildings, when I say creatively, a lot of standards end up resulting in something like this. Oh, I have to create ins and outs. I have to create variety. So it ends up being repetitive. What's interesting about this example, they're both buildings of a similar color and a similar scale. This actually has fewer ins and outs, but it's a more creative use of where modulation counts, using it to create a corner, and using it to create a more interesting roofscape. And some of those elements are still happening at the ground level for the frontage, so you start to see it all coming together in this building.
I have a quick question about that slide.
Yeah.
Can we go back to that slide? What drove the distinction there? The architects, the builder, the community? How do you get 2 different products?
In this case, this project, I know it was architect and developer. And this is part of a master planned neighborhood where it had more robust series of standards in place. And then the team, it was a better design team and an inspired developer. This one, not so much.
Dawn, would that be something that could be addressed, though, with the development standards, or maybe if we do the architectural design standards, so that we're encouraging more of the different stories within a building or something, so that we can craft it in a way that helps guide that kind of articulation versus the other?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we're not there yet, but yes, that's something that we've talked about a little bit. But this also this is related to that, the notion I was talking about earlier of the side-to-side relationships as well, from buildings that might be at different heights.
Thank you. That was really the essence of the question. And the second part I would kind of follow up with that is, have you socialized these concepts with the local or regional developer community in any significant way to get some sense is there a good impedance match? Because my sense of this is that in the absence of some set of driving, whatever they are, to either incentivize or direct or essentially control, maybe you just get the building on the right.
Right.
And you don't get the building on the left, which I assume our bias is to get the building on the left as opposed to get the building on the right. I'm just curious about, I guess there are two questions there, but the first question is really, has this been shared in any significant way with the local developer community?
And that's something, I don't know if Phil will want to address that, but we do have that in the schedule so kind of after we get through this phase, there is going to be some outreach to local and nationwide developers to kind of get their feedback on the overall site plan and just kind of the development standards. Make sure that we're coming up with something that is going to be viable.
Okay. Thank you.
And this is just my last, number 10. 10's a nice number. Humanize the architecture. Really, it's related to the previous slide, but there's a lot that can be done to add detail, add a sense of delight and unique identity to the individual buildings, and that's of course important. And we're not seeing too much of that in this one, but again, this project with this sort of mission style, we're seeing it in a very interesting and restrained way. But there's other ways some of that delightful detail that has a human scale can be achieved. So that's my density presentation. Any other questions related to that?
No, I think that's great. I think this is what I was hoping for in our last workshop, is to be able to put words and structure to what we know aesthetically looks like the right type of density, but to actually have some objective measures or criteria for how to evaluate that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's shift to, we're at 11:58. Let's shift to the update on the standards. And so now you've got your packet. And what I'm going to try to do is highlight some of the changes and the updates that we've made, and then after that, drill down and talk with you all about some of the details. And the standards that we might be shifting from perhaps business as usual. So,
Don, before you go there,
yes.
I wonder if I could ask a question. I wanted to wait until you got into this packet. Maybe I could use an example here, and I do have a density question.
Yeah.
Do you have that by page?
Yeah, I do.
Could you go to page 15 for example?
What page is that, John?
15. It's just
Is it labeled 15?
15 on here.
So my page numbers are not necessarily appropriately paginated. Let me make sure.
It's block 4 potential configurations.
Under the block standards?
Go in there.
Block 4 potential configuration. I think this.
This one?
Yes, please. Speaking of density, and I'm a process guy, and I'm trying to understand again. We have workshops, and this is really good for us to get our hands in this. But at some point, it's going to come to us for action, and I believe at some point it's going to come to us for action in the form of a master PUD, and then, for each of these, I believe the process. If we approve a master PUD, what we're really saying. When we approve that, I believe, is that we would be okay with each of these sub-alternatives for Block 4. So we're saying the PUD is great, we're done with this thing. We'll go off and do other things as long as, developer A, B, and C come in, buy those respective blocks, choose from one of the pre-approved. You're struggling with that.
No, I was going to say that part a little differently, but keep going. I'll let you finish.
Pre-approved alternatives. Okay. And if they stay within that, it doesn't have to keep coming back to P and Z over and over and over. I'm thinking and maybe hoping, because we've said we're fine with any one of those alternatives by block. You know, we've had our discussions here, et cetera. So back to the point of density. The density is not the same for each of those three. So I guess that when we bless, if you will, the overall PUD, we need to ensure that if each block develops to max density, that the sum of each block's max density is okay for the overall project, correct?
Yes.
You with me? You with me? And
I think that's what Hillary,
True. That's
The clustering, right?
about before. So
Yeah.
if you look at the whole site, multiply it by 17 units per acre,
Yeah.
then that's our total capacity. But
What-
that's true. So, it's doubtful that each block will be developed at the maximum
you
potential
see where I'm
density.
going though.
Some of them
so
might be less, and then other ones we might do the stacked flats.
This is where we
mixed
talked
use.
about keeping track, but it's not, but I think what we're also saying, and this is where I was getting, the one part I was getting just tripped up on, just make sure I'm checking for understanding, is that if every block developed to its maximum density as is shown, and these are not meant to be necessarily pre-approved options, that's why I made that look, they're meant to be, it's just, we're trying to suggest, we're trying to provide, we can do all these words here, and we have a pretty picture in terms of the site plan. It's just trying to suggest different ways that it could happen and inviting other alternatives. That's what this is meant to be, just to help shore up the standards, these particular graphics. They're not meant to be necessarily pre-approved site plans. But going back to the other point was, if every block developed to the maximum, there's going to be a maximum density overall. So we couldn't necessarily, maximize this, maximize.
we're not going to have density credits going back and forth from one block. In other words, if the developer that buys this chooses the first alternative and leaves some density on the table, we're not going to move that over to some other block or whatnot, right?
John, if
But
I'm
isn't there-
understanding what you're trying to say, if we have a total density of 1,000 units
Right.
on the whole number of acreage here, and one developer comes in and maximizes Block A, fine. And then the next one says, well, I'm going to do less. Is that 1,000 still going to be the total, regardless of the developers, what they want to do? Because then I think it's going to get a little convoluted, saying by the last piece, you only have 5 units you can build. So I don't know how, but I think, is that the gist of your question?
That's a gist of,
Yeah.
the kind of a process as this plays out.
Well, that was kind of my question. The later developers would have less to work with, presumably, right? Because if the incentive is to maximize the revenue and the return on the development, then the earlier developers might have more density. The subsequent would have less density, right?
If it was played out literally, but I don't think that that's how the market's going to work. But we will make
Okay.
sure that the overall number, so if we were looking at kind of maximum potential, is not going to exceed what's allowed. It's more likely we're going to see kind of a mix of, some people aren't going to want to do stacked flats or a mixed-use building. They're going to want to do the cottage homes or the
Right.
townhouses or something. So,
Right.
but we will make sure that the numbers are going to work, figure out a way to track that internally and with Ignite's help.
Right. And maybe, I don't know if helps at all, but like this, so we're showing this footprint of a potential mixed-use building here. We're showing different, in our block standards, there's only a few blocks where we're proposing that this kind of thing could happen. It wouldn't necessarily be transferable to other sites. Now, we can talk about that. That's amongst us all as whether we should change that assumption, but that's what's built in right now.
Sorry, but let's say phase 1, you have a density of 400 units. And phase 2, you have a density of 200 units. And each phase has its density. Can we not just say, this is what the density is in this phase, and if it's a product of townhouses or condominiums, that's the max you can build. If you want to build less for some other reason, that's great, but if you want to go more, sorry, we can't, to control the whole density of all the acreage, and I'm just putting that out there, whether that's for a discussion or not, so that the developer still can change perhaps the design and the layout based on what's approved here for our design standards, but the density in each one of those phases has to stay the same. if that's some sort of discussion, whether staff can, not quite sure.
We
think
could,
it's-
yeah,
Density
we
problem
could
is
certainly
a
look at that
problem
and see what
overall
makes sense.
without taking from Peter to pay Paul down the road, and I don't know if that'll work out. So,
Am I wrong, just looking at on page 9? Sorry, we're derailing your presentation.
Okay.
But phase 1, just eyeballing it, looks more dense than phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Is that just illustrative, or is that?
You're talking about this image
Yeah.
that we're looking at right now? It is illustrative.
Okay.
This is the illustrative, this is a phasing diagram on top of the previous illustrative plan. This is getting revised. What your comment is telling me is that we probably need to create a phasing graphic that is a bit more generic over, a more generic underlay under it to eliminate some of that confusion.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I would look at this as a developer and think, well, if I want to get in on a higher density project, I need to get in on phase 1. Could be one interpretation.
but
I
also
think the phasing map, so the building shapes, the outlines, the ones that are more rectangular, those are stacked flat, so you actually have more units in those than just a single family or a townhouse. So it's, yeah, we do need to probably pull off some of the detail and then just keep it in the design documents or the development standards documents, so you can kind of see the, how each block could be developed. And
Okay.
Yeah, and that
It'll
we
help.
had a discussion at the other workshop that a developer might not come in and say, hey, I want to do
Yeah.
phase 1. He might come in and somebody might come in and pick phase 2.
Yeah.
And there's where this whole project might start. And we had kind of that discussion at the last workshop, working with that type of scenario.
But you do want to develop certain phases first, do you not?
Lift station, roadways,
That's a criteria, isn't it?
utilities,
Yeah.
all of it.
Well, maybe
Well, help me
Phil
with
can
this.
address that, because we did talk about that, or I brought it up the last time at the
You understand the
workshop.
phasing a little bit better than me.
Yeah, so the way that the phasing is shown on here, it's driven by infrastructure. So, and where the district boundaries are. So the River District and the Lake District have a certain amount of funding in them that can be used to build the initial infrastructure. So in phase 1, we build that initial infrastructure, the blocks get sold. You take that revenue from phase 1 and it's seed money for phase 2. And that's why it seems a little bit backwards. Typically, you think about phasing, you would normally start on the inside and work out. But here, because remember, the big challenge here was when you pull the waterfront out, you've taken the most valuable piece of property out, yet the infrastructure nut still has to be cracked. And that's why we had to develop the phasing in this manner, because phase 1 is the most economical infrastructure location to build on. That makes sense,
Well, it's in phases, and we're going to do phase 1 first, then phase 2, yeah.
right? Yep.
But when you say doing phase 1, is that the development of that particular townhouse as being done first? Or is it based on what a developer might come in, and when we sell these parcels, he might say, well, I just want to do phase 2 because that's my niche. I don't want to do phase 1, which is a different niche for that particular developer.
I think you'll see when Don gets into the development standards that the options exist to address multiple market types
Right.
within phase 1. So if you're a townhome developer, a single-family home developer, a stack flat developer, you have an opportunity within this. And the way that the process would work with Ignite is the backbone infrastructure is in place. It gets RFP'd by the block. So back to Commissioner Mandel's comment, you wouldn't necessarily see this level of detail. That block gets RFP'd. You get multiple RFPs, and your RFP is single families, and Commissioner Lutrop's is townhomes. Ignite evaluates those against these development standards, as well as some other criteria, economic criteria, community values. And once that's accomplished, Ignite can then pick which one is most appropriate for here, understanding all the other things that might go on. And back to the other comments that we've had here, if townhomes keep getting picked, I think at some point Hillary and Don will stand up and say, wait a second, we can't have more townhomes. We have to have a diversity of product in here, and that was one of the community values. That's what we heard from the Planning Commission. We needed to time out. The beauty of Ignite, with the city's input is, okay, well, let's pause and wait. We can afford to sit in on this deal longer because we're not here for the immediate dollar. We're here to create a great neighborhood, and we're prepared to wait to get that.
Right, and then I remember also, based on phasing, the city services, let's say sewer and things, those will be phased in to a point where, all right, we have connection A, and if we're at phase 1 and no one wants it, but we have to be at phase 2 down the road, the city is working on that as far as how they're going to handle that, because I remember that was the last discussion as well we had at our workshop.
Right, and so when I mentioned the backbone infrastructure, the sewer line actually comes from the west. We have to run the sewer line from Grand Mill all the way to this point here. So the sewer line gets put into here. You can imagine it coming along here. It stubs to this alley right there, and that's the low point. And now it can pick up this block and this block. The water line gets run into here, but there's no services that come off of those pieces of infrastructure. It's just the backbone. The developer comes in here, buys this, and says, I want to do townhomes on this. Okay, how many townhomes? You install the sewer in the alley, and you install the services off your water line in the front. This developer comes along and says, gee, I want to do single family on the back part here, but I do like the idea of townhomes on the front. Then they would go in and install the services in that condition. But this one needs to get built out first before you can connect to this one.
Mm-hmm. So it's pretty much like any other city services that are provided to any piece of property. It's going to be in the front of the, let's call it your street, and then what you want to do on that piece of property that you buy, it's up to you to get to that point.
For the individual services.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's basically the same concept here. It's just we haven't quite defined yet where that connection is going to be from the city side of it yet.
Correct, and that would come through the RFP process,
Right.
and that's where these development standards are so important, because you're communicating to the developer ahead of time. Here's the values that we heard from the community, a year and a half ago when we first started this project. We've got them boiled down into a set of development standards, and so that's been run through the commission. The commission has put its stamp on it. The staff has put their stamp on it. We're moving forward pretty confident that this is the type of product we want to see here. And remember, it's also underpinned by market viability. Mm-hmm. There's a real estate group, Heartland, Don and I smacking us occasionally when we come up with ideas, and they say, that's not going to sell, and that's going to upset our apple cart here. And of course, we have Ignite in the city saying, you need to make this thing flow. So, and by the way, why aren't you done yet? So that's some more context.
Okay.
That's helpful.
So is it anticipated that you'll have more than one proposal in phase 1?
Yes.
And Ignite will have to choose between proposal A, B, or C?
Yes, and you can imagine that a developer may come in and this is, Hillary mentioned this earlier about, we need to get through this because we want to get the commission's kind of gut feel about this and reaction to it. Once we're through this, our next stop is the development community and saying, here's how we intend to do this. The discussions we've had so far, very early on, some of the developers have said, well, I want to come in and I want to take all of this. And that becomes a value question for Ignite. Do we want to give all of those blocks to Commissioner Ingalls to develop, or should we disperse them across the community so folks that may not have the capital to take all of them on have opportunity here? And again, this is a little bit different because you have
so in that process, that determination is going to be made by somebody.
Ignite.
Council or Ignite?
Ignite. Yeah, that's...
So Ignite will make the choice whether they're going to sell to one person or 100 people.
Yes, that's the way it's shaping up now. And remember, there's the mayor and Councilmember English on that board.
I understand that.
Yeah.
They just what the process is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and I come back to Lewis's earlier question about have you socialized with the development community out there, not just Coeur Lane, but broader. I quite frankly don't appreciate don't understand the different schematics we have here. I just don't have an eye for that stuff. I'm more like maybe John is a process. Because you got to sell this stuff. You want to get some, you set some criteria on it so you have some type of control. It's just a very interesting process.
Yeah,
And I'm glad to hear, though, Don has worked through these
hold
things
on,
before, so you can give some recommendations when we don't.
Sure. Go ahead, Hillary.
Chairman, in just being, understanding we have some limited time to get through this, we're trying to wrap up around 1. CDA TV said we want to try and do that, so we only have less than 45 minutes, and Don he wants to walk you through this. If we could maybe get through a little bit more before some more questions, because what we're going to ask is that after you have the presentation day, you take this, you read it, you send any questions, feedback to me. We'll get you the other materials from this presentation. We'll get this presentation uploaded to the website, and we'll share that with you as well. But I think it's really important that we can kind of dive into this so we can figure out what they need to hear from us, and then we'll figure out if we need another workshop to dive in a little deeper.
Thanks for that.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Lou, you want to?
Oh, just quickly, I'm in the innovation business. It seems to me that this is not the first time this kind of challenge has been faced by a community. You're talking about a multi-phased master plan, development. You don't have to invent the solution. Someone else is confronted with the same set of questions we're facing here. So I would just ask and pose the question, given that that's true, and intuitively it seems to me that the last person in is not going to have the same advantage as the first person in. So I don't know how you solve that problem, but I'm sure it's not the first time that problem's had to be solved. So you don't have to invent the answer. Someone else has kind of dealt with that problem, and I'd just be curious about, you don't have to answer the question now, but I think it'd be very interesting to understand how other folks have managed that multi-phase nature of a development, where you're talking about building to a fixed density over a larger,
And you're absolutely right, and we've talked about that amongst our team talked about it with Tony Burns and some of his board members, the mayor, our steering committee. How does this get rolled out so we do it in a business-like way? Both Heartland, the real estate advisory, they provide long-term those advisory services, as well as GGLO has been involved with it, which is why they're on the team, because we know we need good guidance. But it is a topic that is down the road. We're going to get to it, but right now we've got to satisfy this group, and we want to make, I don't want to say satisfy is the right word, but we want to make sure we understand the values, because you all represent the community and see what comes through our community, and we want to make sure your stamp is on this, just like we wanted the community's stamp on this as well, particularly the waterfront public space.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. Okay, Don.
Okay.
Back to you.
Those are great, good questions. Just running through some of the changes since you've seen this last time. The frontage map has changed a little bit since the last one, and it's still based on many of the same principles, where the most important, I'll come back to the map in a minute. There's A, B, C, and D types. A and B are both relate to buildings facing the street. Oh, A is related to how we sort of curate the waterfront street, and some of those, Commissioner Messina, you were asking about the character of the buildings along that street. This is trying to set forth the expectations for that. This hasn't changed that much. We've provided still some of the same photographs there. There's some nuance as we move to frontage type B. I'll just jump back to this briefly. So A pertains to everything in blue. When you see some of this, some of the dash lines, there's some flexibility here. B are things in purple. So they're similar frontage conditions, but there's less restrictive as you move to the interior of the site. We think it's most important, we've talked about this quite a bit, to make the riverfront drive be very, very special. Frontage type C, and what's the expectation for homes and buildings where they're front-loaded garages, and what does that condition look like? And it really, the primary goals here for doing this is to not have a street dominated just by garages, so some porches and other projections from the buildings to help break up that street wall, and making sure that we get street trees and sort of a good curb appeal, literally at the curb with some of the vegetation, get actually good street design, and those two things working well together. Frontage type D pertains to the retail that we've talked about, whether it's a mixed-use building, a retail as part of freestanding, a small one, or even potentially office as part of that. This is an example where there's some retail and even actually some street-level office and office above. And how does that, how do we guide the development on those parts of the streets? Because as I was talking about in the earlier density presentation, you know, how these streets and sidewalks all add up. Really, of course, the waterfront is key, but as we step back from that, the quality of the neighborhood is largely going to be determined by how these buildings engage these streets. And so a couple of things that are other things that are different about this map from the previous. We talked about expanding the flexibility for where, I think this was Commissioner Fleming, you mentioned this, where we could have additional retail, potentially frontage along here. So that's what the dash lines here are talking about. And we were previously talking about sole use office here. We investigated a little bit further. Probably is not going to be viable on these blocks. So that's why I talked about office mixed with retail along this over here, part of Riverfront Drive at the western entry. So there's some of the updates to frontage. Since the last time you looked at it, the map is basically the same. I did have swapped out the numbers a little bit. That's a detail that's probably not important to you. But it starts again with the simpler blocks 1 and 2, and the way each block it kind of goes along the riverfront street, then to the blocks just beyond uphill, and then back to the blocks at the western end of the site. And so I'm going to come back to some of these details and hand you something else after I go through this overview. But the diagrams have been mostly cleaned up and revised a bit. As I said before, the potential block configurations really are that. They're meant to provide just examples of what we're trying to get at with the standards. And our photographs also are trying to do that, but just on a block-by-block basis, trying to demonstrate some of that flexibility, and not saying that these are necessarily the only solutions, that there are others out there. Block 2 is largely the same. I'm just going to move beyond that. I mean, it's very similar to Block 1. Block 3 standards, in the previous version, we didn't have a good cut yet at the data and the various elements, whether it's allowed building types, setbacks, and things like that. There's now been some pretty solid thought into how that might shake out for this block. The diagram has been updated. As you get to block 3 and 4, they start to have more flexibility in terms of that density and layout. And that's what these potential configurations are trying to communicate. Block 4, when you get to block 4, I just want to, so previously when I showed this to you, these were reading sort of side by side, but some of the blocks get a little bit more complicated. So as you take this away and look at it in more detail, I just want to give you a for example. That's why I'm pausing here. So because this block has really a street only on streets on two sides, on the south and the east side, and then a slope on the north side with potentially a walkway here, it's difficult to have a more standard series of development, more regular series of development standards apply to this uphill portion. So what you start to see when you look at setbacks and building separation are different ways that this can be treated. Oh, sorry, this is for pertaining to the different frontage types here. But if I flip to the next page, it's dealing with different sets of setbacks and building separations north of the alley versus south of the alley. And that was, again, trying to, as we get to these central blocks, trying to guide that flexibility for the wider range of building types and densities. Block 5 has a similar, also a very interesting block, very unique block, has a unique shape. It does have streets around all 4 sides, has the mid-block connection, as you know. And again, the setbacks and building separation standards there's different categories of them depending on the flexibility and the type of building that one might propose along, for example, Riverfront Drive. And as you get to a wider range of uses that we're proposing to be allowed on these blocks, we start to, we bring back some of the parking quantities, looking at, and I'll bring this out when I compare the comparison to C-17 in a minute, but addressing the different off-street parking quantities for the different uses on a block-by-block basis. And one of the things to consider, to throw out there to you, if you're looking through this, is the potential for some of our retail, restaurant, or office spaces to potentially share some of the required parking on the street. Because we have a fairly dense development. Some of our blocks are pretty tight. And so what kind of flexibility can we provide to relieve some of that pressure on parking, which both might allow us to achieve that fabric that we're looking for and sort of meet the price point in various development options. All of the blocks, except for Block 10, have a more robust take at those more detailed standards per block. So there was Block 6, which was the one on the end. It's the last of the riverfront blocks with frontage type A, minimum building height along the street. And again, when we get these unique block shapes, it's where these standards are trying to adapt the flexibility and the expectation to these different unique site conditions. Blocks 7 and 8 are both most likely to be front-loaded residential building blocks. So that's why they're grouped together. The standards perhaps a little bit more simple because it's a bit more of a simple building type. And in Block 8, there is the option, we've heard from you and we've heard from others that alleys, maybe we want to minimize the number of alleys and not propose any more than we need to, which is why we've limited it to the riverfront blocks. But if someone did want to potentially develop at a slightly higher density in a fee simple lot pattern, there might be the potential to bring an alley back into Block 8, and that's what these potential configurations are trying to show you what that might result. For example, it might open up some townhouses here. If this block here was to develop, as has been shown illustratively, as some stacked flats, multifamily product, might be appropriate for a transition between the two for some townhouses along here to take advantage of the grade that would be happening along this block and create a little bit of an asymmetrical condition where you could park down below. Might seem logical, but trying to make sure that people understand those possibilities. Block 9. Block 9 is a different animal altogether because it's up on the plateau, has access and visibility or potential access from Celtice, and a potential wider range of uses here. And so we've reflected that in this list of uses and building types, and the details flow onto the next page. And then, again, through looking at the potential configurations, trying to communicate that wide range of uses that might be possible here. And the thing is that if this, the challenge with this is these each have a different kind of adjacency to the blocks below and to the top of the slope. And so building in some guidelines and standards to attempting, I don't think we're quite there yet, address those nuances on the adjacencies between these potential uses. Block 10 needs a little bit more work, so I'm just going to skip over that. That's the one that's most outstanding at this point. And then blocks 11 and 12, previously I just called it block 11, but they really are two blocks, and if we need to break these out into two separate pages, we can. But they really go hand in hand. It's that western edge to the site, and has some similar flexibility to block 9, but less so because of the narrow shape of the site, the narrow dimension, and so trying to deal with that both through the standards and through these configuration diagrams. I'm going to, I think, stop there. The building types have not changed since the last time you've seen it. And did they receive a copy of what we showed last time? I can't remember.
They did, yes. I sent them, well, let's see, so the PowerPoint last time?
Yes.
That, I don't think we did give you guys that. We did give the information on the two examples that you and Mark had provided, the Renko Station and the other Heights?
The Heights in Vancouver, yes.
They have that. I don't, yeah,
Okay.
we need to make sure we get both PowerPoints.
Well, the only reason I'm asking that is that this will give you a chance to browse through these in more detail. We're referring to the building types for some standards at this point, and need to do more of that to address some of the things that we've talked about today in terms of some of those things related to massing and details on the buildings. But the majority of the advancement of the standards have happened in the blocks since we last talked together. And so with that, I can pause for some more questions. I've put together a matrix here. There's a lot of stuff to go through. We're trying to compare just typically what we're showing for Atlas to C17, which is the use that, or the zoning district that largely surrounds the site, as you know. So what my thought is here is I'm gonna try to walk through. This is another good time though for some more for questions. Interrupt me, because I'm going to try to provide just the rationale for the difference, and if you want to make comments, debate the difference, feel free to do so.
I just got a few questions before we get into this, and you don't have to answer this, but at least maybe we'll address it later. On Riverfront Drive, is there going to be parking? There's going to be parking along that or not parking? Is it going to be for residential only? Is it going to be for public? What's kind of the plan for that? Because we've run into some issues with other streets that are close to the river, and residents mentioning there's no parking for them, and then they're, it's just congestion. And it's just trying to address that. Not that we have to answer that, but that's something that I think perhaps at some point, I don't want to take up a lot of time here for that. And then on our last meeting, we had a lot of our city services staff here, fire, sewer, police, so on and so on, and they had some questions and comments, and I just want to make sure all that, those comments, some point in time, do get addressed, and so we know what those comments were and how we're addressing some of those issues down the road. Let's see, what else did I have? And as far as any, walkways and streetscapes and things like that, especially streetscapes, we always show great pictures of mature trees and bushes and things like that. So again, not that we have to answer this question now, but perhaps are there going to be some requirements to have a little bit better than just the normal, yes, we'll put a plant in 3 years from now, it'll look great like the picture does. At least in the riverfront and the public space transition areas and things like that. Those are my, one other thing, again, it could be addressed later. There was talk at some of the park and rec meetings of the docks being, some of those spaces being used for the commercial rental that goes on at Third Street, and not taking anything away from the commercial companies that do that. But my concern was just the safety of not the companies themselves, but the use of whatever those particular boats and whatever they rent related to the people who rent them, and not take anything away from the people who rent them, but some have experience and some don't have experience. As Commissioner Flemmer brought up, the safety issue to the proximity of the public access, and if that does come to a point of them leasing some of that commercial space out, really addressing that particular issue of the rental aspect. I think it's a great opportunity for the city to generate some revenue, but looking at the safety side of that. That's all I got right now.
We have, so two of those items we've already discussed related to street trees, landscaping, timing of that. What was your first one? Park and Riverfront Drive, we've discussed that as well. And so that is critical to make sure we build that in, and then also notify anyone who lives there that it is going to be for public use for the project. So that'll be an important thing. City departments, so you'll be reviewing the minutes from that workshop on Tuesday night at your regular meeting, and we'll make sure those all get distributed to the team, the departments, and then get any other comments from the departments. And then your safety one will go to Parks and Rec Commission for their.
Great, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Just one question. I don't know if this is jumping ahead, but you mentioned earlier the importance of kind of protecting or making sure we get those Riverfront Drive blocks right. Riverview Drive.
Well,
Riverfront Drive. And so are the design standards, like I just glanced and it looks like 1, 2, and 3 are fairly similar, but on this, it seems like.
are you talking of 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the blocks?
Yeah.
Yeah. They are similar.
Okay.
Yep.
But for this, do we need to be even more particular about setbacks and streetscape on those blocks, just so we do get them right?
Well, that's what I would, this is the challenge with this task. Yes. And so what's in the handout that Phil just gave you is more generic.
Okay.
And it was, it's intended to help facilitate discussion about some of the details that are in here, rather than walking through page by page,
Yeah.
bit by bit right now, try to hit some of the things that are more common. And then, so the stuff, when you look at 1, 2, and 3, yes, they're similar, and they're intended to be a little bit more detailed, a little bit more pointed towards getting that character that we're hoping for, that we're shooting for on Riverfront Drive.
Okay. So when we do our own review after this, we should look at those with
Yes.
kind of eye towards making sure we get
Yes,
as specific
please.
as possible.
Yes, please, and thank you for the clarification. Okay. Anything else before I lead in? Okay. So, as I said, so this is pretty simple, going through just some of the list of things that are relatively common throughout all the standards that are in the blocks right now. So for thinking about structure height, the current standard for C17 is 32 feet. You all know this, 2.5 stories. In terms of some of the density that we're looking at, perhaps trying to achieve a little bit more flexibility, I'm proposing that we change this to 3 stories, which might allow slightly more narrow building type, based on some of the townhouse types that we looked at earlier. That's primarily the reason why, or even a potentially narrower single-family house. So that's one thing. And that applies for single-family, duplex, and townhouse in the proposal that we're putting forward here. For multiple family buildings in C17, 45 feet, 3.5 stories, we're proposing to use a standard that's inspired by R34, which would be basically 63-foot height limit. and potential for 5 stories for those mixed-use buildings. Really no change at this point in time for carports and garages. We may want to, in discussions that Hillary, Phil, and I have been having, we may want to look at the potentially accessory structures, revisit that. Might need perhaps a little bit more height there is my speculation. For uses such as retail, restaurant, and office, because of again, here, perhaps a slightly different approach, thinking of limiting retail and restaurant, if it's a freestanding building, to 2 stories or 30 feet, and any sole-use office buildings on the site to 3 stories or 45 feet. And some of this comes as a result of looking at, especially like Block 9, and what's going to be realistic for what you can build on there and what you can achieve for parking and things like that. Also, not to just to dominate the other buildings that we expect within the neighborhood. And then, as I've mentioned a number of times now, in a few those blocks along the Riverfront Drive, having a 2-story minimum height limit to achieve that frontage. And if there's a use, such as like a sole-use retail that we might have along there, that at least mimics that height. So we have a taller 1-story space. So thinking about lot size requirements. Now this is something that's definitely, this is a bit more generalized, and it varies from block to block a bit, but I think it's a decent summary. For single-family houses, since this is about proximity and trying to fit things in, we're proposing to minimize, or make the minimum lot width for single family in general 35 feet, and the 75 feet for the depth is really a function of the geometry of the site and the geometry of the blocks that we've created. Because as you know, there's a limited amount of space from the street, from the Riverfront Drive, the river itself, and Celtice. So to create that block structure, that's what's really driving that minimum number. For duplexes, and in this case, duplex is being conceived of as a fee simple side-by-side duplex, almost like just a 2-unit townhouse, 25-foot minimum width. And where that comes from is thinking about a very narrow unit, potentially as narrow as 20 feet, with a 5-foot setback and similar depth. Again, same functionality for the decisions on the depth of duplexes and townhouses. And townhouses proposing a minimum width of 20 feet. Now we know this is minimums, not proposing necessarily any maximums, but trying to bracket the lower end of this spectrum for all of these fee simple type buildings. And then for multifamily, this is the proposition here. If we're going to have a minimum lot size of saying 1.5 times the footprint of the building, might need to investigate this a little bit more. But in looking at the small multifamily buildings that we've proposed, and even illustratively on the site right now, a standard like this seemed to work.
I think we're going to have to get deeper into the weeds on this, because we're going to deal with side yard setbacks, we're going to roof overhangs, which have been a challenge around here with our cottages, roof, snow load,
Yes.
catch basin, just a mess.
Yes.
And also, I think we're probably on water table issues in some of these lots. Can we do basements? Because then we got the window well issue, which is the fire exiting issue. So all of that lands out in that side yard, and before we know it, we're window well to window well, and nowhere for the snow to go, and blocked exiting. You know, it's just
It's a good point.
It gets challenging in this climate as well.
Yeah,
So
you're right.
we need to be more explicit than just say, hey, you can build wider, and then we got all these side yard and overhangs, and so it drives a different solution.
Right. So you'll see some of that dealt with in more detail when you get into the blocks.
Okay.
It perhaps might need a little more based on what you're saying.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would add to the mix is you have a provision for zero lot line. And if there's any site that is a great candidate for thinking about zero lot lines, or we're trying to create this density of using those side spaces, this is it. So want to make sure that that's still part of the mix. And actually, some of that is addressed here in this next part. Did you read ahead?
No.
No? Oh, I just,
I'm anticipating it.
okay. Setbacks. And so starting with single family and duplex, and thinking about them from a front-loaded and rear-loaded condition. So starting with front-loaded, we're proposing to have the front-loaded front setback at 20 feet from the back of the sidewalk, and going to that issue of not dominating with garage, requiring some amount of projection, whether it's a building modulation or a bump out or a porch, that sticks out at least 4 feet towards the street, and that it's equal to at least half the width of the garage is the proposition here. So 5 foot interior setbacks, 5 feet to streets side-facing streets, street side of the building. And perhaps if we need more nuance to this, we can discuss this. I actually simplified this from what I had earlier, because one of the things that we talk about when you look into the blocks is making sure that on all street ends that asking the developer to not necessarily just cut the unit off like a sausage, especially if it's a townhouse, but that the unit somehow addresses the side street, whether it's a wraparound porch or bays or some kind of modulation of the building. That's something that I think is essential for creating this great streetscape and curb appeal, and there's multiple ways of doing it. And the zero lot line requirement or provision is repeated here, and because these are shallower lots than we might see in some places, proposing a rear yard of as little as 15 feet. In projects like this throughout Western Washington and Western Oregon, this is how we typically hold the line at to create a usable outdoor space that might be behind the unit. So when we consider the alley-loaded single-family or duplexes, reduce the front setback to 15 feet to the primary building wall with projections and porches being able to stick out at least up to 6 feet within that. We could talk about these details. Perhaps it could be massaged or go less. Same side setbacks to both interior sides and street-facing sides. No front garage is allowed, of course, when we have the alley condition. Zero setback. And then thinking that the rear setback to the rear garage in this case would be 2 to 3 feet from that alley margin. We're proposing our alleys at 20 feet. We've looked at them based on some of the comments that we heard last time for snow removal, compared a variety of different examples, and think that we can achieve the necessary functionality for snow removal and emergency. Well, there won't be emergency access in the alleys at a 20-foot wide alley tract or right-of-way, with then garages or buildings set back 2 to 3 feet beyond that for 24 to 26 feet. Townhouses, which is, I'm just switching to the next page. It's really the same set of requirements, so it's really just about the different width of the unit and more units that are attached, of course. So I'm just going to go beyond that one to the next page. We think about multifamily buildings and Atlas proposing a 10-foot setback from from the right-of-way line. 10 foot from any, when you see pedestrian access easements, those are typically those mid-block connections through the blocks, proposing 10 feet from those, 10 feet from interior side property lines to create a 20-foot separation between buildings, and then similar requirement, minimal requirement for setting back from alleys. Although I have a hunch that in this case, most developers may choose to set back a little bit more from the alley, given what the dimensions we have on some of these blocks. Mixed use residential retail is largely the same. The only difference is that the setbacks on interior property lines may be a little bit wider because we anticipate that these buildings may be a little bit taller. And it's starting to anticipate some of what you were talking about the side-to-side relationships between buildings of different sizes. Did I leave that sheet in here that says remaining uses? Is that in there? It is in your thing, isn't it?
Under fences?
Oh, did it jump to fences?
It went to fences.
To fences, I think.
Yeah. No. Just went to fences.
Okay. Sorry, I got myself a little bit confused. Yeah, we'll just talk about fences here. So going along with the frontage character that we were talking about earlier, proposing to reduce the maximum height of a front yard fence to 3.5 feet and recommending 3 at the, that's our recommendation, creates a more friendly condition at that front sidewalk and that in that threshold area that we were talking about earlier, and keeping side and rear fences provision at the potential for 6 feet. And then I'm going to jump to parking. So we're proposing still a minimum of 2 off-street spaces per unit for single-family duplex, also for townhouse. But as you look at the individual blocks, due to, again, some of the tighter sites, we may want to consider maximum parking requirements. Let's just use a townhouse, for example, or even a small lot, single family. Perhaps you allow 1 additional parking stall beside the garage, or if you're going to have, Hillary and Phil and I have been talking about this, if you're going to have an accessory dwelling unit there, you may have 1 additional parking stall for that, but potentially no more. And this is just again, so that we don't create too much parking, especially on the blocks that are along the alley-loaded blocks that are along the Riverfront Drive. So, and then jumping to multifamily, so this is probably, catch your eye on this one. We know that the 1 bedroom is typical for studio now, 1 per unit for a typical studio, 1.5 for 1 bedroom, 2 per unit for 2 bedroom. We've been in talking with Heartland, we have been planning for an average of 1.25 stalls per unit off-street for the multifamily structures. And again, it all goes back to these tighter sites and trying to minimize somewhat the cost of any structured parking that you might have beneath the building. So love to hear what everyone thinks about this. If we need to transition back to the city standards, we can do that. It might, we need to recognize that it might limit some of the options on some of those blocks, like say on 3 and 4, where we show sole use multifamily structures, not necessarily larger mixed-use buildings.
Did you want feedback now? Or?
Sure.
The only concern I would have is that if you're basing this off of a Prius, or are you basing it off of a Ford 150? I mean, Idaho is not Portland.
Well, I know.
I've driven my Suburban in Portland. I'd never do that again. So
I lived and worked in
that's-
Calgary and Edmonton where
I guess
exactly this issue.
Yeah, so I guess that would be my comment about,
Yeah.
about parking in general,
Right.
shaping it to the local realities, even and certainly in the multifamily.
Yeah.
I think the predominance will be trucks as opposed to, sedans.
Yeah. So I'm not, so that gets to a little bit of parking stall size. I'm not as concerned, honestly, about size. I do think we can accommodate the larger sizes of stalls and parking spaces, whether it's on the surface, or in the buildings.
Well, it would
gets
as it
to
relates to total
quantity.
number of units. If the size of the stall has to be larger, you're limited to 1.5, 1.25 units per, 1.5 off-street parking spaces per unit. It certainly does have an effect.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I certainly don't know what the answer is, but
Yes, if I
certainly-
may, we did talk about that earlier this week, and I think the plan is to do the 9x20, which is our standard size in the city, to make sure that we're not creating that issue where you can only have a Prius if you want to park in the project.
John, you got
Yeah,
a question?
Well, I am concerned about the parking as well. I asked myself, really, and you look down all of these standards, whether it's 3 stories versus 2.5, whether for a restaurant you can accommodate 50% of your parking requirement on the public street over here. What is it that's unique about Atlas that we think that's okay? Tuesday, we're going to see an infill project come to us. It's in our packet. Why shouldn't they have 1.25? What's different here versus the guy that's trying to, make a cool project on Government Way have 1.25? So, I'm a little concerned with, I look at these changes, if you will, for Atlas neighborhood in that column as, what we would look at as deviations for a PUD. What gets us in a comfort zone when we look at deviations, when we see a PUD, is we get to lock it in. In order to give you this little break on this and this and this, you're locking that PUD in, and we can kind of see the synergy of the whole thing is going to work out pretty good and whatnot. In this case, there's a little less comfort zone in just applying a whole bunch of new standards for this area when we don't have that lock, if you will. That said, I know that to make this project successful, we've got to kind of loosen up here. We got to loosen up and let this thing have some breathing room to be successful. That said, I think that the building heights, the setbacks, and some of these things, I'm very comfortable with. But parking is the one thing I think that's the most concern here, because this is going to be a huge draw. The kayakers, the people coming down to that beach, and we see that. Chairman, you mentioned that yourself. The struggles that we have with some of these waterfront streets around town and whatnot. We had that issue with Bella Reeve. You remember, that's a private street that public people are parking on to get down to the waterfront, and so. If we give these kind of concessions on parking, plus we got all of the locals headed down there, I just don't see enough parking down there, and I'm a little concerned. So,
Have we looked at perpendicular parking like downtown Wenatchee or somewhere where you've got retail on the street, but you're only allowing perpendicular parking away from the view? Somewhere that we can leave not parking on the view side of the street, but to do perpendicular. I know it demands a slower rate of speed because people have to pull in and back out. But we put the diagonal parking down on Sherman, and it was a big hit.
Okay.
I mean, even if we could do diagonal
Yep.
in pockets
Yep.
that aren't just the whole thing, one long diagonal parking on both sides or singular, but we have pockets where you can go in diagonal and get your density.
Yep.
And not steal too much from the view, nor have this just a whole street of parking.
Yep.
I mean, and that would be the extra space when you want to do a street festival or something. You'd have
Right.
that extra space you could cordon off.
Right. Well, I appreciate all of your comments. And in terms of diagonal, we're still showing it at least illustratively here, and when you look in the block standards for that block, it's still being shown. We have been talking amongst ourselves about bringing more of that, especially into these streets that are perpendicular to the waterfront, and perhaps reconsidering this block a bit. Perhaps there's a little bit more off-street parking that might be shared of some sort. Any other thoughts that I'm missing from our conversations?
The bottom right-hand parking lot.
Oh, well, we have this parking lot here.
Right.
Yes.
We're going to expand.
We're going to expand the parking here. And the other thing that we have talked about, and I know this is, we all drive. We're all pedestrians sometimes, and we're all drivers sometimes. The potential for, if there is a larger parking lot up here somewhere, whether it's a public use or private use, office or grocery or something like that. Grocery is a little different beast, but especially for office. Maybe there's a provision for sharing in situations like that. So it's a long way of, I think, answering yes to especially the nuance of parking along some of these other streets.
Maybe this would be a good opportunity for you to see what other places have done where they've successfully met that and come back and say, yes, this has 1.25 and here's how it works and it's very successful, et cetera. You know, I think this is, there's some excellent opportunities here to, like Lewis said earlier, who solved this problem ahead of us, you know, and how did they do that?
Well, I'm struck by the development in Spokane that's along the river. What is that called? I can't remember.
Kendall Yards.
What was it?
Kendall Yards.
You know, Kendall Yards has the street parking as parallel. There's no diagonal parking, as I recall, at least the last time I was there. And that seems like a shortcoming to that particular density. That was a project that was built to significant density, and illustrates where parking can change the quality of place. So if you can find a place to park, and there's plenty of retail and there's plenty of restaurants and there's substantial density in terms of townhomes and flats, if you really can't find a place to park, the quality of the whole experience, which you're really trying to accomplish here, and I would commend you for that, you could fall short. So that would be my only comment about, in terms of, reflecting on what are the other comments of the other commissioners, is that parking is not a trivial issue.
I know.
So I don't know the answer. I think we've raised questions and I've provided some suggestions, and it's one of those things that's an inescapable reality of truth. We don't have it's not an urban, it's more, it's not an urban where you're seeing that there's lots of different transportation choices. I think most of the folks who are going to be going to this mostly will be in automobiles, and the most will be trucks, as opposed to bikes and, public transportation. Although there will be folks who will be making use of that, I don't think it'll be the predominant customer, if you will.
Are the parking courts that you showed earlier on kind of the design principle, are those parking courts, do those enable actually more parking density, or are they just a way to hide the parking?
It's first and foremost a way to hide the parking.
Okay.
And because they're not structured, it all depends upon how you're actually cracking that nut. If you're doing that combined with potentially some tuck under or garages along with there, that gives you a little bit of a parking bump. And we've been anticipating that, where we show like these here, the potential for some underground parking and tuck under or tuck beside is what was thought of originally in here. I appreciate all your comments. Got to do good. You want to do good housing. You want to do good urbanism. You got to do good parking. It's one of my professors back in school, one of the very first things we learned. So, it's a really good issue. I think we're going to need to study it further and come back, either show examples. It's probably a combination of showing a few more examples and tweaking this based on the feedback that we're hearing from you here today.
Don, one other quick question. Just given consideration, again, going back to those docks and parking, at this point, maybe the docks won't be there, but if they are there at some point in time, and what is it, Riverfront Drive is public parking, people are going to try to find a spot as close to a dock at some point, if those docks ever do get built. I'm not saying that, but again, even though we might not be saying docks, but if it's a good revenue and we do docks, then, you know, what do we do with, I don't know how many spaces are there for people to say, yeah, I'm pulling in, meet me down here, and you can park and we'll go out on the river somewhere. So again, that parking situation with docks, I think might have to be addressed regardless of whether they're there or not down the road, because again, as we say, we all like to drive, but we like to drive close, and I know it's 10 after 1, and
Mr. Chairman, yes, I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of the time.
right.
We do need
And,
to wrap it up.
Before we do close this meeting, I know we might have some other questions, but perhaps, you know, we can address those questions if it isn't related to parking, as you asked for that question. Perhaps we can do that in the form of emails to staff and things like that. One other thing, I would love to know what staff's comments are on this matrix, given, you know, we pass back our emails and stuff. And hopefully this matrix and this package we have would go out to all city staff departments as well, so they can give us some more feedbacks on the matrix, regardless of its parking height, the snow removal, things of that nature. So, you know, if we all keep this communication going with all the departments that were at our first meeting, that would be great. Unless we have a really different question.
Yeah, I have a very, very specific
Okay.
question, Mr. Chair. It was raised, so this little proposal here, how I am looking at it is the proposal for the Atlas neighborhood. I'm looking at it as PUD. John said we have PUDs, we do, well, this is a PUD, right? So that's how we're looking at this thing. This is the Atlas neighborhood PUD.
And those are the deviations.
Yeah, so, but that's it. And so when we approve this, whatever we do, that is, if I may speak broadly, that's the rules. So, you know, you're not going to vary from the rules because here it is. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Pete. One other thing, I would like to know when this developer building meeting kind of thing, and maybe Phil, you can address that. What's the future date for that, and how is that going to be presented? And yeah.
We sit in the back of the room.
Last question. I'll
We
let
haven't
everybody
actually
go to lunch.
established a date yet. The schedule's gotten a little bit shifted around when we added this additional workshop and some other things are happening, but it'll be sometime this summer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just encourage you to have enough latitude so you can take some of their thoughts and incorporate it in here.
We intend to. That's been the concept from the beginning. Part of the nature of the team that we have here is GGLO does a lot of work with developers, and so they're bringing a lot of those thoughts forward. The same thing with Heartland, and so they've brought a lot of that data here forward. We want to show it to you guys, then we're going to go ground truth it.
Okay, thank you.
Is there a date projected for us to have the PUD come in front of us? Is there a timeline?
It's dependent on how these workshops progress. So at this point, it sounds like we might even need one more workshop to dive in and then bring you the package, unless we can get enough done via email and some updates at maybe our regular commission meetings.
Yeah, I would imagine we need one more of these. You know, whether it's televised or not, please let me know. But
You look fine.
like
Tom. You look fine, Tom.
that's like,
It's
wow.
not like surprises.
I'll never get voted in again, I don't think.
You look fine, Tom.
You just do
But,
looks.
yeah, I think probably, as Phil, you stated early on, we're not in a rush, but we do want to get it done because we only have one chance. So, and I understand Ignite wants to kind of move it ahead so we can get some funds for building what we have to build as far as parks and infrastructure. But I think probably one more, at least another meeting as soon as possible. I'm sure the commissioners are very flexible in their schedule to get this done, so we can have another meeting and stuff. So just let us know. Let me see. That's all I have, unless someone else has something else. No?
No.
Okay. I appreciate it.
Thank
Don, appreciate it. Phil, appreciate it.
Thank
And
you.
staff, thank you, and everyone here that
Thank you for your comments.
has been here since we've been here. Thank you very much. If
Nice
not,
work.
I'll
Very nice work.
call this meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we're still here though.